Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 191, Developing Aran Village. Kant took a small step forward. This mysterious and dangerous cave made him more and more uneasy. These black fur, black skin, and a few black scales on their bodies all indicated that they were demonized creatures, including their red-blooded eyes filled with brutality and madness. However, these demonized wolves were not entirely demonized creatures. They looked similar on the surface. However, their veins, blood vessels, and brains still carried the original nature of the creatures. This included that they knew to fear. If they were real demonized creatures, they would definitely fight to the death and not retreat. They would only leave after killing Kent and the others. Otherwise, these demonized creatures would fight to the death until the very last moment. This raised Kant's doubts. Standing at the entrance of the cave, he held the night sword tightly in his hand. The Ravenstern Rangers followed behind him. They looked into the cave with a grave expression. They had said it before. There was an evil force inside the cave. Although Kant did not know much about the underworld invaders similar to the Pender continent, he could not help but think about the movies and literature he had seen in his previous life. Kant muttered in a deep voice, could it be the nest of the demonized creatures? It was possible. However, he didn't dare to lead a team into this cave. Although the level 5 troop class was strong enough to kill some ordinary species or these fake and inferior demonized creatures. If he had encountered a savage species like the demonized lion, he had no choice but to sacrifice a few level 5 Mamluks to kill it. And fighting in such a narrow tunnel definitely added the battle difficulty. If those savage demonized creatures charged straight at them, Kant's soldiers could not scatter and dodge, so they could only grit their teeth and fight. Even if they won, it would be an ugly fight, they had to suffer heavy losses. But it's all right, Kant lowered his head slightly. On his vision, the dialog box instantly popped up and refreshed quickly. The system interface for the troop classes level up. 20 Rhotic Peasant can level up to be Rhotic Tribesman. 10 Rhotic Tribesmen can level up to be Rhotic Spearman/Rhotic Crossbowman. It only spent a little of dinar. Kant directly chose to level up. A mere 300 dinars was not a big deal. Soon, 20 Rhotic Tribesmen holding pitchforks appeared. At the same time, the 10 Rhotic Spearmen that Kant chose to level up finally put on leather armor and held spears. However, the slaughtering knife at their waist was not removed. It was still a melee weapon, and behind them was a simple wide wooden shield. It looked like they could only be compared to a Swadian recruit. However, these Rhotic spearmen finally had some looks of a proper footman troop. Although they were still weak, they could still barely withstand the enemy's attack. If they were in the desert, these Rhotic spearmen might be enough to fight the low-level Jack Allen on the battlefield. However, as a level 2 low-level footman in the Scenway range, they still needed to be careful. According to Kant's calculation, only a level 4 troop class could survive in the Scenway range. Only a level 5 troop class could live a stable life. If a level 2 or 3 troop class came to the Scenway range, they would become free meals to these demonized creatures. Thinking of this, Kant looked into the cave with a solemn expression. He ordered the warden, peasant, and tribesman beside him, everyone, return to the top of the mountain. Leave 2 people at the edge to guard this place. Understood, everyone replied. This was the best solution at the moment. Kant's troops were few and only Mamluk could withstand the attacks of the pseudo-demonized wolves. He could not let all 7 men guard this place and make Aran village lose its ability to defend. The 10 Rhotic spearmen could not be considered the true combat strength. Thinking of this, Kant made a decision in his heart and returned to the council hall. He instructed the 2 Mamluks, all of you return to the mountain immediately. Get the 10 Sarandian horsemen to escort Manat and the camel caravan back to the Oasis lookout. At the same time, instruct James to lead the 7 Ravenstern Rangers, 13 Swadian Sergeant, and 10 Swadian snipers to the Aran village on the camel caravan. Also, arrange 20 desert bandits to be on standby at the post house. Another 20 desert bandits will set up a temporary camp at the mountain pass to be on standby. Understood, the two Mamluks nodded. Ignoring the fact that their armor was still stained with blood, they immediately got on their horses and galloped carefully along the mountain path they had come from. As a level 5 troop class, their exquisite riding skills could barely allow them to ride their horses through the mountains. Moreover, they also knew where the road was smoother. That's good. Kant nodded with a calm expression. These arrangements were of utmost importance. Once these troop class moved in, the Aran village could be considered safe in the Sinway range. He could also leave temporarily and leave the development of this place to James for the time being. Although James' main job was to be a doctor, it was not a problem for him to watch over a village. The combat and command abilities of this field doctor were not weak either. Moreover, if any of the soldiers were injured, he could treat them in time. After all, although there were many demonized creatures or other beasts in the Sinway range, as long as they were protected by armor and shields, their injuries could still be recovered, which meant that there was a possibility for them to survive the injuries. At least they did not have to worry about it. Like the 23 Sarandian horsemen, they were severely injured by a demonized lion. As they did not know anything about medication, they were completely helpless and could only watch them die. As for now, Kant still planned to stay here. Aran village was still too weak. Although Trondheim was waiting for him to return and level up into a castle, Kant did not leave immediately. How could he give up on this village that was in imminent danger and leave? If Kant really left with his team and this small village encountered a demonized creatures again, the village would be wiped out in the blink of an eye, leaving Kant filled with regret. I still need to put in the effort. Kant couldn't help but shake his head. When Manad returned with his team, James would probably arrive in the middle of next week. Turning his head to glance at Mamluks who was still resting in the council hall, Kant had a little plan in his mind. He couldn't just sit around and wait for death. It would be great to let these Mamluks form a team, leading 10 Rhodic spearmen and 20 Rhodic tribesmen for training with the help of the demonized creatures in the Sinway range. At the very least, Kant needed them to level up to an intermediate troop class in a short period of time. This plan was realistic. Kant had once learned the habits of demonized creatures in the academy. It was the territorial behavior. Any savage demonized creature would not appear within a 3-kilometer radius of another savage demonized creature. Occasionally, there would only be a small number of ordinary demonized creatures. However, there would not be too many ordinary demonized creatures. This was their territorial behavior. It was also what hunters or knights relied on to hunt demonized creatures. According to Kant's understanding of these terrifying creatures, if all the demonized creatures hidden in the Sinway range were to gather together, it would not be a problem for the entire dukedom of Leo to be flattened by these demonized creatures. After all, this mountain range that could even obstruct the Naran desert was just way too big. Kant's current position was only at the edge of the edge. If the road was fixed, it wouldn't even take more than an hour from the mountain pass to the Aran village. In Kant's mind, there was stone-paved road that could be built. After the garrison reached the mountain pass, Kant would immediately use it to connect the Sinway range to the Naran desert. He would let the Aran village be officially included in the development area of the Trondheim fortress. A large amount of precious resources in the mountain range would be continuously transported back through camel caravans. It would become the driving force for development. If there was a chance, Kant would want to build terraces in the Sinway range. After all, after he developed agriculture in Oasis Lookout, he knew the hardship and pain of doing that in a desert. It was thanks to the system that it had developed to its current scale. Although the Sinway range was dangerous, the environment was basically suitable for growing crops. It was much better than the barren Oasis Lookout. As long as the water source was guaranteed, the development of agriculture would be even faster. Moreover, it could also develop animal husbandry. The opening of this second base was Kant's most successful move in developing. That was the reason. Kant turned his head to look out of the window. 23 Sarandian horses were still walking not far away. They looked lonely after losing their horsemen. However, they were plenty close to Kant, so they did not leave. Instead, they began to walk around the mountain peak, stepping on the soft soil. From time to time, they would walk around the cemetery where the horsemen were buried. When Jocelyn comes again, we can sell them. Kant shook his head and sighed. Kant did not need too many horses. Selling the Sarandian horses produced by the system and indirectly letting them return to their own world could be considered a good ending. After all, these were all top-grade Sarandian war horses. Even the noble families of Viagirs would cherish them very much and would not treat them carelessly like weak horses. This was the system's method of recycling. When Jocelyn left, he also bought the weapons and equipment of the system's troop class that had died in the previous battle. It solved Kant's problem. After all, he did not want so many exquisite items to be spread to the dukedom of Leo. It was still great to be able to exchange some dinars with the system. Now, we just have to wait for James to lead the team here, Kant thought. Green smoke appeared in spirals. In the kitchen of the council hall, the aroma of food cooking spread out. It was the peasants making dinner. After all, with the setting sun and the approaching dusk, the sky was about to turn dark. If they did not make dinner, they would probably have to wait until the evening before they could let everyone have a warm meal. The kitchen of the council hall was not big. It barely maintained the food needs of more than 60 people. Chapter 192, A Week's Change. Time passed quickly. A week's time had passed. It was this week's Wednesday. At the entrance to the Sceneway Range, James and Manad were riding their horses in the front. Behind them were 7 Ravenstern Rangers, 13 Swadian sergeants, and 10 Swadian snipers. Accompanying them were 30 camels loaded with all kinds of supplies. Behind the camels, there were 50 fully armed Swadian knights who were holding huge all spears and waiting for orders. All of them were level 5 elite troops that sent from Oasis Lookout this time. Their combat strength was guaranteed. After returning to Oasis Lookout, Manad had already set up Arran Village. The dangers and difficulties that Kant encountered were clearly explained to Firentus and James. In order to ensure the safety of Lord Kant and the stability of Arran, James immediately accepted the order. Once again, Manad led the way. With the troop class that Kant had requested, they immediately set off. Moreover, they also brought an additional 50 Swadian Knights troop, allowing these high-level troop class that could charge on horseback and fight shoulder to supplement their combat strength. They had to ensure that Lord Kant's safety was guaranteed. Their own lives could be ignored. However, to them, Lord Kant was their supreme existence in this world. They travelled arduously. It took them 3 days to arrive at the mountain pass of the Sceneway Range from the Oasis Lookout. It had to be said that these single-humped camels played an absolute role. Although its short-distance acceleration was not as fast as the Swadian warhorse of the Swadian Knight, the advantages of these camels were clearly shown through this long-distance, day and night journey. The Swadian warhorses were already very tired from being tortured by the desert. However, the single-humped camels were still relatively okay. If the Oasis Lookout was further away from the Sceneway Range, the war horses of the Swadian Knight would probably be out of breath. It might even become dehydrated or sick due to the harsh environment. The desert was not an environment that the heavy cavalry was good at. Even if the system enhanced the abilities of the heavy cavalries, they would still not be able to adapt to the long journey in the desert. This was also the awkward weakness of Kant's troops. In a long-distance assault and strategic attack, they could only rely on the desert bandits, elite desert bandits, and Sarandian horsemen. As for the fully armoured Swadian Knight, Swadian heavy cavalry and Mamluk, they could only move around the fortress. In other words, they could only carry out strategic defense or tactical attacks. As for long-distance raids and strategic attacks, it was impossible. Logistics and physical requirements alone were already a huge challenge to them. Kant had once thought. If only the Naran Desert where he was based had a Nile River similar to the desert of North America in Earth, as well as the Euphrates River and Tigris River in the Middle East's desert region. Such a large river that crossed through the desert would be great. With the system, he would definitely be able to quickly grow into an overlord-level character. The river could be used as a transportation route, allowing these heavy cavalries to have the ability to attack strategically. It was not like now. The powerful heavy cavalries could only move around the Oasis lookout. This was also what Phyrontis was worried about. They had already defeated the high-level Jack Allen of the Kingdom of Greymane. As far as they concerned, there would not encounter such a large-scale enemy again in a short term. This made Phyrontis anxious inwardly. He was eager to make a contribution and fight for Lord Kant's salvation in this world. But he needed to wait, and Kant also needed to wait. They still needed to develop. Although their current strength was enough, they were unable to shake the forces of either side. The Mannheim coast by the Sea of Stars was full of races and had complicated relationships. Although Kant had defeated one of them, the high-level Jack Allen expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane, it did not mean that he able to crush the whole kingdom. They defeated the expedition army because they had the geographical advantage. A vast natural barrier protected the Oasis lookout. The plan that Kant and Phyrontis had made was very successful. This was because no one was able to carry out a long and fierce siege battle without sufficient supplies after crossing the Naran Desert. This was unrealistic. But even so, the high-level Jack Allen of the Kingdom of Greymane still showcased their absolute battle strength. Kant already had some scruples in his heart. What would happen if the distance between the two was shorter? The former Jack Allen captives were right. These high-level Jack Allens were indeed invincible in the Mannheim coast when it came to close combat and heavy footman sequence. They were so strong to the point where the lizardmen could only rely on city walls and crossbows to defend themselves, so strong to the point where even the elves could only offer friendly letters on trade cooperation and peace. Trondheim's strength was still relatively weak, including against the Dukedom of Leo. Kant was confident, if he launched a surprise attack, he could easily take over the Stone Pass. But Kant's strength would also be exposed. What came to him next was definitely not the Dukedom of Leo's welcome for the strong, but an absolute fear for a potential threat to themselves. They would not hesitate to unite against a potential threat. Using the force they had cultivated in the Dukedom of Leo for 100 years, they would crush Kant to death in the Oasis lookout. This time, it would be very thorough. They would not even give Kant the chance to continue his exile. What they wanted was a corpse that could no longer threaten them. The stone-paved road had been built. Following the mountain ranges of the Seenway Range, it slightly curved from the Aran village to the entrance where Kant had entered. The 3-meter-wide road was paved with neatly cut stones. The gaps were filled with lime. In order to make the road waterproof, drainage channels were dug on both sides of the reinforced roadbed. Even if there was heavy rain, the road would not collapse. Instead, the rainwater would flow into the lowest mountain valley along with the excellent drainage system. The most important thing was that there was finally a road in the complicated mountain. This meant that they were able to move quickly and no need to worry about the trouble caused by the complicated environment. Even the cavalry could move quickly. This made the Swadian knights, who had already had enough of the soft sand layer in the desert, to tap their horses' stomachs lightly and increase their speed. They moved quickly along the mountain road towards the Aran village and could not wait to protect their Lord Kant. Meanwhile, the 31 humped camels were still walking at a leisurely pace behind them. The footmen and archers were accompanying them on both sides. With these rangers, sergeants, and snipers, it would be a suicide for the ordinary demonized creatures to come across them. Even if it was the savage demonized creature, it would be killed by these elites if careless. The Ravenstern Rangers were top-notch archers. The Swadian sergeants were the heavy footmen with the best defense. As for the Swadian snipers, even if they used heavy crossbows which were not as strong as siege crossbows, they still had plenty of combat experiences. 3 layers of defense: far, middle, and close range. This was also the reason why Kant asked these troop-class soldiers to come over to assist in defense. With their presence, it would be the moment when the strength of Arran village would increase. Even if there were savage demonized creatures came over, there was no need to worry too much. No matter what, those demonized creatures were all wild beasts. The close combat of these creatures was many times stronger than humans, but humans had wisdom, command, and weapons. As long as they avoided the attacks, they could grasp to the weaknesses of these creatures. These demonized would only end up being dug by their hearts and become Kant's spoils of war. And within these short 7 days, Kant led the troops of the Kingdom of Rhodoks. With Mamluks and the Ravenstern Rangers as the foundation, they swept through the surrounding mountains and blocked the ambush of the pseudo-demonized wolves a few times at the Evil Cave. The initial 50 Rhodok peasants and 10 Rhodok tribesmen had all been upgraded to a level-up 3 troop class. 40 Rhodok trained spearmen. 20 Rhodok trained crossbowmen. It was these level-up 3 troop classes that formed a dense phalanx of spears. Combined with the continuous arrow rain attacks from the Ravenstern Rangers, they were able to keep the pseudo-demonized wolf pack inside the Evil Cave. As they experienced more and more battles recently, more and more concentrated battles, there were signs of leveling up again. They would be leveled up in unison. At that time, Arran village would welcome a new batch of level 4 troop class. This was all thanks to the danger of the Sinway range. Or rather, it could be said that with the help of Mamluk and the Ravenstern Rangers, as well as for the 20 wardens who had first killed most of the enemies with their superb archery skills, these low-level Rhodok soldiers would have suffered heavy losses long ago. They could only let Kant lead them to level up in batches and would not be as simple as it was now. Before long, James and 50 Swadian knights had already stomped on the stone-paved road and quickly arrived at the foot of the mountain peak where Arran village was located. The mountain peak was not very steep. There were cliffs on the east and south sides. The Evil Cave on the west side, which located at the halfway point of the mountain, was still considered flat, but there was also cliffs beyond the cave. Only the area where there were stone pavement ruins on the north side was a 40-degree slope. Not to mention one could walk easy on it, even a warhorse could directly rush up. However, at the top of the mountain, a half-meter-high city wall had already circled around the edge of the mountain, temporarily marking out the current area of Arran village. Although it could not stop the demonized creatures that really wanted to invade, it would not be a problem to block out some wild beasts. Thousands of acres of land was quite vast. The council hall was only built in the center of the north. Even if there were 10 more houses, they would be insignificant to the thousands of acres of flat open land. On the south side, the city wall had already been built. However, the dense forests and shrubs had not been completely cut down by the Rhodok people. It had at least 400 acres of land. And according to Kant and the architectural team's previous calculations, the overall area of this mountain peak was about 1,600 acres, which was close to the land area of a small village. As Kant's development plan, whether it was developing into a small town or a large castle, the area of this mountain peak was completely enough, and more than enough. Chapter 193, Archery Master's Performance. James and the 50 Swadian knights were the first to arrive. Even though they were 2 mountains away, the sound of hundreds of horseshoes hitting the road was like a thunderous waterfall. Even the Rhodok trained spearmen were standing behind the city wall, guarding the wooden gate. They looked nervously at the road outside. They looked at each other and noticed the panic in each other's eyes. They were also afraid of the thunderous horse hooves outside. Kant walked over quickly and waved at the extremely nervous Rhodok footman. "All right, don't just stand there. Open the gate and let our troops in." "Understood." The Rhodok trained spearmen looked at each other, but they still chose to listen to Kant's orders. They quickly opened the gate and looked at the Swadian knights appeared at the bottom of the hill with a strange expression. It was anger, hatred, and a certain kind of confusion. This was due to the relationship between the 2 countries. After all, 30 years ago, the mountain region of Rhodok was still a part of the Kingdom of Swadia. These people of Rhodoc had even cheered for the succession of King Harlaus. If one were to say that the kingdom of Swadia collected a lot of taxes, it was close to exploitation. However, after the nobles of Rhodoc came to power and established the kingdom of Rhodoc, the exploitation did not decrease much. Instead, because of the successive years of war, many of the young people had sacrificed their lives. Compared to the kingdom of Swadia back then, it was even more difficult. The so-called hatred actually had little to do with low-level civilians. It was just the noble families thought that after King Harlaus inherited the kingdom of Swadia, he levied too much taxes on the noble families of Rhodoc. Therefore, the two countries split due to their interests and began a hostile status for more than 10 years. Despite the hostility between these two countries, the interaction between the people continued. At the very least, the merchants were still trading with each other. Especially for Variga, the most important and nearby trading city of the Kingdom of Rhodoc, it was also an important place for the two countries to trade. Commerce was extremely prosperous, and economic exchanges were very frequent. No one would refuse the exchange of the dinar, and no one would refuse the dinar to enter their pockets. Rumble. As the gate opened, James, who was at the foot of the mountain, brought the Swadian knights to the peak. In reality, if they really wanted to come up, the gate alone would not be able to stop them. It was estimated that the Swadian knights' huge lance would be able to easily destroy the wooden planks of the gate with a single charge. This was due to their high respect for Lord Kent, which made them to choose to wait. Otherwise, with the noble status of the Swadian knight, they would definitely use the horsewhip to ruthlessly whip these Rhodoc mountain people, letting them know what it meant to be noble and lowly, what it meant to be a social class, and what it meant to use the most revered etiquette to treat the noble Lord Knight. Those who came from the continent of Karadia had their own thoughts. This included love and hatred, as well as the concept of social class that was long cultivated on the continent. To a certain extent, if Firentus wasn't a system hero NPC, he would also belong to the class of the Swadian Knight. And in the Kingdom of Swadia, he was addressed with the title of Knight when he was called by the others. This was the reason why the others usually called him Knight Firentus. But because he followed Kent, the one and only unique existence, to some extent, he felt a greater honor. These Swadian knights also felt a sense of honor because they were able to fight under the leadership of Lord Kent. When they arrived at the peak of the mountain, they rode on their war horses, they raised their spears and saluted respectfully. Merciful and great Lord Kent. Their voices were in unison, filled with fanaticism and respect for Kent. The people of the entire Aran village on the mountain peak were attracted to them, especially the soldiers of Rhodoc. They were shocked, and there was worry between their brows. If it wasn't for Lord Kent leading them, they would have long fought to the death with these Swadian knights. Although the final result was most probably that the low-level Rhodoc soldiers suffered heavy casualties. But at the very least, the dignity of the Kingdom of Rhodoc could not be humiliated. All right, Kent nodded, and nodded in satisfaction towards these Swadian knights. He waved his hand and said, "All disband. There's no need to be so formal." He paused, at the same time, he reminded, in this land of miracles, the Kingdom of Rhodoc and the Kingdom of Swadia are friends. There's no difference. Understood, the 50 Swadian knights immediately replied. These elite cavalries did not have any doubts. After answering, they quickly dispersed under the lead of their respective captain. As knights, they disdained to provoke the Rhodoc people. At their stage, there was no point in provoking them. The Rhodoc trained spearmen and trained crossbowmen, who were only level 3 intermediate troop classes, were also willing to relax. Both sides were safe and sound. Kent and James, who had come from afar, returned to the council hall. The Rhodoc people had already brought hot water and squeezed honey out of the beehives found in the Sceneway range and put it in the water as a dessert. James under the stars for at least 3 days, he was replenished with energy after the desert. Not long after, the sound of horse hooves came from the hillside again. However, it was Manit and his camel caravan who came. Kant sent people to invite Manit into the council hall, and at the same time, helped to carry down the various supplies on the camel's back. This time, they brought back a lot of things from the Oasis lookout. They were all carefully selected by Manit. "Drink some honey water," Kant asked the servant to pour another cup of honey water and served it to Manit, who was sitting on the chair next to him. He then said considerately, "At that time, I only meant that James to come over and take care of Aaron. If you come again, I don't think your physical strength can withstand it." This Nord merchant did not inherit the strong body of a Nord man. Although he was healthy, it was still a kind of suffering and torture to travel in the desert for a long time without a good rest. Manit chuckled, "It is my honor to serve you. Mr. Manit still cares about you." James was middle-aged and in his 40s. He turned to Kant and said with a smile, "This village is related to your development, Lord Kant. It is also a way for us to work hard." "Thank you very much," Kant nodded. While the three of them were talking, Rhodoc people carried the goods from the camel caravan and piled it up in the storeroom of the houses. At the same time, 7 Ravenstern Rangers naturally gathered with the 20 Ravenstern Wardens and became the captain and leader of their team. They also listened to these level 4 archers briefed the situation around them. The 13 Swadian sergeants and 10 Swadian snipers also followed. They had just arrived here and needed to quickly understand the environment. Of course, the danger of the evil cave was especially emphasized by the Wardens. After all, the last few fierce battles had all started at the entrance of the cave. The 7 Mamluks were fighting with their lives and the 20 Wardens' superb archery skills. There were no accidents. However, they also found that the pseudo-demonized wolves in the evil cave were becoming more and more violent and ferocious. As if they had sensed that there were humans at the top of the mountain, these demonized wolves gathered and wanted to rush out of the narrow cave entrance and slaughter everything outside. The pseudo-demonized wolves with the typical characteristics of demonized creatures naturally had such tyrannical emotions. This was currently the most noteworthy enemy. In order to deal with this evil cave, there were 10 Rhodoc-trained spearmen guarding at the flat land outside of the cave. There were the squad that monitored the movements inside of the cave. If there was anything unusual, they would blow the horn on their waist. At that time, the troops stationed near the council hall would immediately assemble. Before they were completely annihilated, they would reach the evil cave and kill those crazy pseudo-demonized wolves. At the same time, they would obtain a large amount of additional experience points. The leveling up of the troops were currently dependent on this evil cave. Just as everyone was visiting. Woo! A rather dull horn sound suddenly came from the west side of the hillside. The soldiers who were originally patrolling there were stunned. However, the 20 Ravenstern Rangers were the first to react. They quickly shouted to the wardens, sergeants, and snipers behind them, "The demonized wolves are ready to attack. Everyone, follow me." There were only 10 Rhodoc-trained spearmen at the evil cave. It would not be a problem to hold off the demonized wolves for a few minutes. However, as time passed, the spear formation formed by these 10 spearmen would be broke through immediately. At that time, once the demonized wolves scattered in the complicated mountain area of the Sinway range, they would cross the cliffs and city wall, launching a sneak attack on the Aran village. It would definitely become a very troublesome matter. However, for the archers or footmen who happened to be paying attention to the evil cave at the top of the mountain, they would be able to walk down very quickly. It wouldn't even take 20 seconds. On the slope outside the evil cave, the Rhodoc people had already used wooden planks and stones to carefully build a 5-meter wide staircase so that the troops could rush down in the shortest time possible. They were able to come to the platform that was completely paved with wooden planks and became the main force to resist the pseudo-demonized wolves. These soldiers quickly came to the platform. In the depths of the cave, before the demonized wolves launched a real attack, they had already formed a formation. Demonized creatures. In the front were 7 Ravenstern Rangers, and behind them were 20 Ravenstern Wardens. All of them held the heavy bows in their hands and drew the bows into a full moon shape. The arrows were already placed on the bows. Pairs of scarlet eyes appeared in the dark depths of the evil cave. It was as if the wolves glowed with malevolence and brutality. "Stupid," the Ravenstern Rangers slowly spat out these words. The bow in their hands was slightly lowered, and the arrows were instantly shot out. In a blink of the eye, the eyes in the interior of the evil cave instantly dimmed. Along with the whooshing sound, the arrow rain fell like a torrential rain. The 7 top Ravenstern Rangers only aimed on those undetectable scarlet eyes from 100 meters away and made the inside of the evil cave filled with miserable wails. In terms of continuous shooting skill, these top archers were not weak at all. Chapter 194, Probing Deep into the Cave. Inside the council hall, James and Man had already heard the mournful wails. Their expressions changed slightly. They had yet to see the pseudo-demonized wolves in the evil cave. But hearing these mournful wails was definitely not something that could calm people down. They could not calm down while sitting here leisurely drinking honey water. Kant took a sip of honey water and said, "Relax." However, the two of them looked at each other. They both noticed the worry in each other's eyes. The mournful howl of wolves was amplified through the entrance of the cave, almost like a loudspeaker. They could hear it clearly in the council hall, and even the Rodic-trained crossbowmen had a look of shock on their faces. The situation in reality might not be optimistic. They looked at Kant. But their lord was still drinking honey water, as if he was listening to beautiful music. It made their already anxious hearts slowly lift up. James had just arrived in this world. At the same time, he had discussed the dangers they had encountered with his old friend Phyrantus. Those howling jack-allans were the greatest enemies that the Trondheim fortress had ever encountered. Even now, they were wary of the kingdom of Greymane on the Mannheim coast, which was beyond the Naren desert to the north. They were even constantly on guard, afraid that the other side still had some strength left, that they organized another expeditionary force to appear in the southern part of the Naren desert and once again became a formidable enemy on their way of development. This wolf howl made James think of Jack Allen. But just as they were worried, the mournful wolf howl stopped. Kant put down the honey water in his hand and smiled. He said to James and Manad, "Don't worry, isn't it settled?" At the main entrance of the council hall, a Swadian sergeant covered in blood came in with his sword and shield. His body was covered with 2 layers of heavy armor, and his linen robe was covered with dark red blood. However, the voice under the iron helmet was full of energy. "My lord, the enemy has been completely annihilated at the entrance of the cave." "Very good," Kant nodded as if he had expected this. He waved his hand and said, "You guys go and clean up the armor. Let the Rodic people clean up the battlefield." "Yes," Swadian sergeant saluted and left. James and Manad turned their heads to look at Kant in surprise. They didn't expect that those legendary demonized creatures would be so easy to deal with. "What else do you think?" Kant smiled and shook his head. "We have to carry out a fierce battle and pay more casualties before we can deal with the pseudo-demonized wolves that surged out of the evil cave." James and Manad's eyes were filled with confusion. Kant smiled and stood up. "Come with me. Those pseudo-demonized wolves are no match for us." The 3 of them walked out of the council hall. After dealing with the evil cave, the Ravenstern Rangers and Ravenstern Wardens stood on the mountain peak once again. They leisurely looked at the Swadian sergeants washing their armor and linen robe in wooden barrels and basins not far away. Obviously, they were long-ranged archers, so they left the close combat to these soldiers who were good at close combat. Not far away were the 50 Swadian knights, who were already in formation with their huge lances, vigilantly scanning the west side of the mountain peak. It was clear that they had yet to remove their combat status from the battle just now. "My lord." Seeing Kant and the others walking over, the rangers and wardens respectfully lowered their heads. "Yes," Kant nodded and asked, "How's the situation?" "We've killed 135 enemies. Our side has no casualties." The leading Ravenstern Ranger answered with a relaxed voice, "This reminds me of the most common wolf pups in the Misty Mountains. It's easier than killing those high-level Jack Allens. Very good, Kent nodded in satisfaction. This is really incredible, James was a little stunned. He had seen many fierce battles, but he had never seen such a simple battle. It only lasted for a few minutes. After it was over, there were 135 corpses and the wolves returned to the depths of the cave. When he thought of what Manad had told him before he came, how terrifying the demonized creatures were, he was a little stunned. James didn't know whether Manad was telling the truth or joking. What I said is definitely true. Manad obviously sensed the doubt in James' eyes. He couldn't help but smile bitterly and shake his head. He said helplessly to James, I dare to swear that the demonized creatures in the Sinway range are extremely ferocious. I once talked about this topic with those civilian hunters at the Stone Pass. Sometimes, when the villages at the edge of the mountain range encounter the savage demonized creatures, it almost slaughter half of the village with hundreds of people. But, the demonized wolves here, James looked at Kent. Kent exhaled slightly. Standing at the edge of the mountain peak, he looked at Rodic-trained spearmen, who were still cleaning up the battlefield on the mountainside platform, and said slowly, I don't know either. He really didn't know. These wolves obviously had some characteristics of demonized wolves, but how could these wolves were not the real demonized wolves? They were stronger than ordinary forest wolves. But they were weaker than real demonized wolves. It was somewhat contradictory. But it was real. Kent turned his head to look at the Swadian sergeant who was washing his armor. His expression was somewhat solemn as he said, perhaps, I really should go into the evil cave to take a look. After all, we have to confirm what secrets that are hidden in the depths of this cave under the village. There was also the main quest that the system gave him, which was to explore this cave. This is a little threatening. I suggest that we wait for the time being. However, as soon as Kent finished his words, Manad and James directly voiced out their objections. Right now, just looking at the endless waves of demonized wolves in the evil cave was already enough to make one worried. If they really went deep into the cave and fell into it, the final outcome would be unpredictable. After all, the narrow and deep cave was completely different than the complicated mountain land and the vast sand. No, I think we can try going deep into the cave. Kent said to the two of them, now that the Swadian sergeants has arrived, these 13 top-notch melee experts will definitely not let me fall into danger. This is my confidence to go deep into the cave. Kent continued, moreover, the 7 Ravenstern Rangers will also follow me. The two of them had worry on their faces. They were not combat personnel, and they could not find any suitable reason to dissuade Kent. But both of them knew there would definitely be danger in the evil cave. Kent naturally also knew. He frowned slightly, but still arranged for the two of them, go and prepare some hemp ropes and torches, and also get someone to bring along some charcoal. Since we plan to go deep into the cave, then we should make sufficient preparations. Understood, James and Manad could only nod. Because Kent had already decided. This was not something that they could directly refuse. They moved very quickly. In less than half an hour, 10 bundles of 30-meter-long hemp ropes, 100 torches soaked in oil, a small half-basket of charcoal, food and water sack sufficient for 3 days. 20 Rodic-trained spearmen acted as attendants and carried supplies. By this time, all the preparations had been completed, and the Rodic people were carrying the rattan baskets. 13 Swadian sergeants were holding swords and shields, and 7 Ravenstern Rangers were holding heavy bows. There was also James, who carried a backpack and a Germanic sword. He had taken the initiative to request to join the expedition team. As a battlefield doctor, he could stop bleeding in the shortest amount of time to heal injuries and solve certain illnesses. If there was any accident, he could also save the lives of the injured members of the team. After thinking for a while, Kent agreed. They were ready. The team came to the outside of the evil cave. Because they had just experienced a battle, the thick smell of blood had not yet dissipated. When the leather boots stepped on the ground, they made a clicking sound. It was the thick blood mixed with the soil, the sound of the boots stepping on it. The torches were directly lit, and 2 Swadian sergeants led the way. As elite level 5 footmen, they showed no fear. Behind them, Kent, James, and the other soldiers followed. The cave was still incomparably dark, and the cold chill came with the wind. As they went deeper, it was almost as cold as the night temperature in the Naran desert, giving a cold chill that could penetrate one's soul. Crack! The sound of bones being crushed was heard. Everyone's nerves were slightly raised, but they did not panic. Bones were scattered all over the depths of the cave, as if it was a slaughterhouse. As they went deeper into the 3-meter wide and 2-meter high cave, beneath their feet was the path piled with dozens centimeters of bones. Kant and the others had already gone 100 meters deep. There were still more than a dozen demonized wolves' corpses left here. Under the flickering light of the torches, it could be seen that there were something between their eyebrows and eye sockets. The all arrows. The Ravenstern Rangers walked over and directly pulled the arrows out. After wiping it clean with linen, they directly put it back into their quivers. This was the demonized wolves that they had shot to death with their archery skills when they were outside. Because they were too far away, the Rodic people did not dare to come in and pick it up. Be careful, Kant reminded them. They held torches and went deeper into the cave. Kant kept feeling that there was some evil eyes spying on him. But it was not eyes. But the feeling of being spied on became clearer and clearer. It even made him feel uncomfortable. He subconsciously tightened his grip on the night sword in his hand. A small part of the sword's body was pulled out of its sheath. He gritted his teeth. This evil! The Ravenstern Rangers stopped in their tracks. They narrowed their eyes and looked at the freezing darkness in front of them. Their expressions became uglier and uglier, especially when they looked at the darkness in front of them. There was a hint of shock in their eyes. They slowly opened their mouths and reported to Kant, "My lord, we have sensed the aura of the underworld." "Is that so?" Kant tightened his grip on the scabbard. "You are not the first people to tell me this feeling." The Ravenstern Rangers had already spoken. Deep in the cave, there was a sense of the underworld invaders, the terrible demons. Chapter 195, The End of the Evil Cave. However, Kant did not give the order to retreat. Instead, he turned his head to look at the rangers and sergeants behind him, as well as the Rodic trained spearmen. He said firmly, "Let's continue forward." "Yes," everyone answered in a low voice, but the sound reverberated within the cave. "Yes. Yes. Yes. Yes." The echoes continued, as if countless people were responding in unison. Kant's expression became even more unsightly. But he didn't care. When he led his team into the cave, he reckoned that they had already been discovered by the enemy. With those cunning and vicious demonized wolves, if they had the chance, they would have rushed out to bite and kill them. But they hadn't appeared yet. This meant that these pseudo-demonized wolves were still waiting for them somewhere. There was no need to hide it. However, Kant and the accompanying soldiers walked with extreme caution. Every meter forward, they would carefully check the cave to prevent any hidden cracks or traps from appearing at the crevices of the cave walls. They ensured the safety of troops for advancing and retreating. At the end of the troop, Rodic trained spearmen carried the rattan baskets. They used charcoal to draw on the walls. Every 5 meters, they left arrowheads for tracing. This was to ensure their direction and avoid getting lost in this cave that was deep into the mountain. It was Kant's arrangement. After all, he watched various movies and videos in his previous life. This kind of deep cave or natural karst cave were like a maze for hide and seek. If they lost their direction, they would end up quite tragically. Trapped in a dark and sunless deep cave. After eating their food, they could only watch as the last flame was extinguished. Cold, hunger, fear. All attacked at the same time. In the end, they were trapped and died in this place, becoming a pile of useless bones. Therefore, Kant was very cautious in exploring this evil cave. Not only did he bring out all 13 Swadian sergeants, but he also brought along 7 Ravenstern Rangers. It was a sign of prudence. Although Rangers were long-range archers, their close combat abilities were not weak either. Both were the main forces in battle. As for Rodic-trained spearmen, they were only the coolies in charge of logistics. Perhaps at a critical moment, 20 people could form a sharp and deadly spear formation, firmly guarding the rear and blocking the enemy's sudden attack. Continue to move forward. Kant's voice sounded in the cave. The sound of everyone's footsteps echoed, and from time to time, the crisp sound of bones being crushed could be heard. But in front of the depths, the faint howl of a wolf had already reached their ears. Although the sound was suppressed, the faint growl of the wolves, the violent emotion that wanting to charge forward, was magnified through the reverberation of the cave. Along with Kant and the others' footsteps, it also became more and more manic. The 2 Swadian sergeants at the front were on alert. They raised the torch in their hands. The flickering light shone in the depths of the cave 4 to 5 meters ahead, but their chain-armored boots slowly stood still. Something was wrong. Even on Kant's 2 sides, the soldiers who acted as bodyguards slowly stood still. They raised the thick heater shield to block in front of Kant and looked coldly at the darkness in front of them. A haunting aura with killing intent was slowly spreading out. They could clearly sense that the enemy was slowly walking out from the depths of the cave. Kant held the night sword tightly in his hand. He had also sensed the something. At the bottom of the slope of the cave, the feel of being spied was becoming more and more intense. Rangers, move forward and shoot freely. Kant ordered. Yes, the 7 Ravenstern Rangers behind him immediately stepped forward. The heavy bows in their hands were pulled slightly and the all arrows were placed on them. Their cold eyes were aimed at the darkness in front of them. If there was anything unusual in front of them, they would respond with the armor-piercing arrows that flew in a flash like lightning and could instantly pierce through the skull. The darkness was gathering in the depths of the cave. Nothing unusual happened. Even the low growl disappeared. It was like what they had heard and sensed just now was just an illusion. Get ready. However, Kant's voice was grave. Everyone subconsciously tightened their grip on the weapons in their hands. The Rangers immediately drew out their heavy bows. Just as they were getting ready, mournful wolf howls instantly emerged from the depths of the cave. It was like endless howls were magnified through the cave, and the flapping sounds of countless claws hitting the ground were also getting louder and louder. Beyond the depths of the cave at the very front, numerous scarlet eyes had already appeared there. Like a tidal wave, the low howls that was able to tear one's soul surged up. It was obvious that hundreds of demonized wolves were charging at them. Kant did not need to give any orders. He could not give any orders even with these low howls. The evil cave was amplifying the sound. The low howls of the countless demonized wolves had completely covered any sound that came out of their mouths. Even their eardrums were faintly aching. It was obvious that the sound was too loud and noisy. However, no one was afraid, and no one retreated at the last moment. Whoosh 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 whoosh. The 7 Ravenstern Rangers instantly released their heavy bows that had been drawn into a full moon. They shot out the arrows in their hands one by one like a continuous storm. They kept shooting at the wolves, causing some unusual miserable howls within the shrill howls, and it also extinguished the scarlet wolf eyes. The rain of arrows continued, and the 7 heavy bows shot out arrows almost every second. For these Ravenstern Rangers who had trained their superb archery skills in the Misty Mountains, shooting out as many arrows as possible in a short period of time was their specialty. If they did not use the rain of arrows to exhaust the enemy's numbers, then it would not be easy to engage in close combat. In their world, the barbarian tribes that lived in the Misty Mountains were also good at attacking with a sea of people. In the long passage of the evil cave, one could clearly see the groups of demonized wolves pouncing over one after another, but it was as if they had encountered a strange phenomenon. The demonized wolves in the front row fell one by one. The demonized wolves in the back row continued to advance, and then fell one by one. Finally, in front of the Swadian sergeants, dozens of demonized wolves fell. Although their momentum was still brutal and fierce, compared to the terrifying atmosphere at the beginning, which seemed to be able to break everything, tear everything, and devour everything, the wolves were obviously started to fear, especially the demonized wolves at the front row. Even their speed had slowed down a little. However, the Swadian sergeants were already prepared and would not let them go. 13 soldiers wearing double layers of heavy chain armor passed by the Ravenstern Ranger. The shields in their hands were placed in front of them, while the sharp swords in their hands stabbed forward fiercely. They faced the hundreds of demonized wolves head-on. The sharp swords pierced through the mouths of the demonized wolves in the front row, and the sharp blades instantly pierced the spines and the heads. The shields slapped the corpses of the wolves fiercely, pulling out the heavy bastard sword made by the best blacksmith of the Kingdom of Swadia. Then, they continued to slashing the demonized wolves until their blood splattered everywhere, turning them into piles of corpses that reeked of blood. There was no need for fancy killing techniques. The numerous demonized wolves in front of them were the best targets. The fangs and claws of the wolves tore apart the linen robes of the Swadian sergeant. However, it did not have any effect on the tightly knit chain armor. The wolves only left some scratches on their armor chain, let alone breaking through the defense. At most, it only left a few dents on the thick heater shield that was wrapped in iron sheet. Wild beasts would never be the enemy of the human heavy armored troops. These pseudo-demonized creatures were also no match for Kant and the other top-tier footmen. Even if they were real demonized creatures. As a level 5 troop class, the Swadian sergeant also had the strength to resist and kill those ordinary demonized wolves appeared here. The combat strength of both sides was still not in direct proportion. The only thing that could make Kant worry was only a savage demonized creature. It had completely changed its own form and could no longer be called a beast. It was a true demonized creature. Strength, stamina, agility, cunning, and ferocity, in addition to a certain level of intelligence. It had completely broken away from the concept of a beast with a contemptuous title. It could even be compared to the giant dragons that only existed in myths and legends. However, these pseudo-demonized wolves could not even be considered as real demonized creatures. How could they be considered terrifying and savage demonized creatures? Now, there was only slaughter. Swadian sergeants waved their bastard sword, and one by one, the pseudo-demonized wolves were chopped into pieces. They even held the heater shield in their hands as they pushed forward, step by step, chopping more and more demonized wolves to death and fell under their feet. Even if the sergeants in the front row were tired, the sergeants in the back row would squeeze through and continue to fight. Within the 3-meter-wide cave, the three of them could completely block the passage and let the demonized wolves pile up until the last one died. The thick smell of blood was extremely pungent, and Kant and the others could not help but frown slightly. But in the end, they had dealt with these demonized wolves. "Continue moving forward," Kant ordered in a deep voice. The team continued to move forward. The blood-covered Swadian sergeants did not clean up the filth on their bodies, and time did not wait for anyone. Rather than cleaning up now, it would be better to go back alive and take a nice hot bath. But their eyes suddenly became serious. What they stepped on was no longer a slightly sloping slope, but a stone staircase. The entire team went down and entered a tunnel that was nearly 1,000 meters deep. They actually came to a wide space that was made of stone. With the illumination of the torch, they could still find many ghastly white bones. Kant lowered his head slightly. Under those ghastly white bones, there were many pieces of metal made of iron and copper. James, who was accompanying them, said from behind, "It's armor, longsword, and battle axe." He was a battlefield doctor and had seen all kinds of weapons and equipment. At the same time, he reminded Kant, "Lord, there's a stone door in front of us. From what I see, the situation doesn't look right. Let's get ready first." "Yes, that's true," Kant nodded and raised his hand to indicate that he was on alert. All the soldiers held their weapons tightly. This 100 square meters space was more than 4 meters high. There was a door just in front of the tunnel they came from. It was desolate and unadorned, and the patterns on it were already indistinct. If looked carefully, one could still vaguely found the patterns carried a sense of grandeur and majesty. It did not seem like a trace left behind by an ordinary civilization. Sacred Sun pattern, Kant narrowed his eyes slightly. He was not unfamiliar with these patterns. As he took a step forward, Kant looked at the stone door that was already half a meter wide open. His heart beat faster and faster, because for some reason, that evil gaze seemed to be coming from within this stone door. It was looking at him from behind the stone door. Chapter 196, The Ruins of the Sacred City Behind the Door. Damn it, Kant clenched his teeth slightly. The feeling of soul being stared at by something else was extremely uncomfortable. However, when he raised his head and looked at the faint patterns and the still intact murals on the stone walls, he could not help but suppress his anxiety and looked up carefully. This might be the murals left behind by the forces of the lost city. It could give him some useful information. James followed beside him and also raised his head to look at the murals that had been carefully carved and painted. His face had little bit of surprise. What a shocking masterpiece! That's right, Kant nodded. He was also slightly shocked. Although the paint on the mural were severely worn off due to time, they could not see what it used to look like. However, the carved patterns and the remaining paint still allowed them to draw some conclusions. For example, the origin of this cave. On both sides of the stone door, there were a total of 4 ancient mural paintings. According to their speculation, the murals should be read from left to right. Kant looked at them one by one. The murals were carved with magnificent capital cities, lush fields, merchants coming and going, and terrifying troops. But what caught Kant's attention the most was the first painting. On the painting that symbolized the capital city, hundreds of meters above all kinds of magnificent buildings, there was a 1,000-meter large disc hovering in the air. Countless sacred sun patterns spread on the disc, circulating with a formidable power. This huge sun disk that exceeded Kant's impression seemed to be resonating with the blazing sun in the sky. Golden rays blossomed and scattered around the capital, as well as emitting the essence of the sun into the temple at the center of the capital. Kant could still vaguely see a figure standing in the center of the temple on the murals. Its hands were raised high, like it was interacting with the essence of the sun. Lost City. Kant clenched his fists, and his heart beat faster. Sure enough, the depths of the cave was still the ruins of a civilization that had been destroyed in ancient times, leaving only legends. He could not help but mutter, the bloodline of the sun god, the city where the Son of God lives, the holy city of gold. It was like he had opened a new chapter. And when he thought about it thoroughly, the numerous bones in the tunnel, and the metal residue at the bottom of the bones. It was the legend of the lost city. After hundreds of years of archaeology and searching for historical documents, the scholar of the Dukedom of Leo had come up with a guess. These metal residues were the weapons and armors used by the lost city at its glorious time. However, after thousands of years, the originally indestructible weapons and armors lost to the bones made of calcium. Lord Kant, please tell us what to do next. James held a torch behind him and glanced at the stone door that was still half open. He asked in a deep voice, should we go in or retreat? He suggested, I think we should retreat first and wait for more warriors to be prepared before making any plans. Kant narrowed his eyes and hesitated. Behind the stone door was definitely an important relic of Lost City. Otherwise, there would not be the ruins of the Temple of Lost City on the mountain peak. There were even stone statues and the smaller sun disk dedicated to it. However, those fake and inferior versions of the demonized wolves were coming out from the stone door. If one looked carefully, they could see that the wounded demonized wolves from the cave were also covered in dark red blood when they retreated. They returned to the stone door that was half a meter wide open. In the deep darkness, the torches could not shine too far. 2 Swadian sergeants stood guard at the door. They could only discover that the inside of the stone door seemed to be a bigger tunnel. "Let's go in and take a look." Kant made up his mind. The legend of the lost city had been passed down for thousands of years. It had already reached the kingdom before the dukedom of Leo. In the ancient history that was even older than the previous forces, any danger would probably be wiped out in history. He and his troops could still deal with a mere demonized creature. Even if the lost city still had some mysterious backup plan. However, according to the scholars' most approved speculation, it could be traced back to 10,000 years ago, which was the lost city in the era of the gods. Even if there was still a part of its energy left, thousands of years had passed, how could it pose a great threat to the current them? Everything would be consumed by time. Even the gods who had once been the supreme honor had also retired. The current world was the era of the humans and all the other races. The troops that had rested and reorganized were once again on standby. The two Swadian sergeants at the front looked at Kant and asked in a deep voice, "My lord, would you like to open these two stone doors?" "Open them." Kant waved his hand without hesitation. Since they were already here, they would walk through the main door and entered upright. At the peak of the mountain above them, 50 Swadian knights were still standing by. Any abnormal sounds or shouts in the cave, amplified by the sound effects in the cave, would cause these knights to immediately dismount upon receiving the order. They carried their heavy shields and sharp swords and ran down quickly. It was only 1,000 meters downhill, and they would be able to appear here in less than 10 minutes. This was also why Kant dared to come down. Kaka, kaka, kaka. The thick and heavy stone door was pushed open by the two Swadian sergeants. The shaft of the door seemed to have dried up, but because it was made of stone, as the weathered parts fell off, the slightly opened door was completely opened easily. The darkness within was completely revealed in front of Kant and the others after the door opened. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. An eerie cold wind instantly blew from within, brought forth a coldness that seemed to penetrate one's soul. Kant and the others could not help but tilt their heads slightly while standing in front of the main door. This cold wind spread out along the tunnel of the cave. And just as the cold wind blew. "What is that?" The Ravenstern Rangers pointed forward and said in a grave voice, "There are lights." Kant also looked up. In the eternal darkness within the stone door, right in front of where the Rangers were pointing, two bright lights appeared, one on the left and one on the right. They were flickering with a faint light, and although they were very far away, they were very clear. They were slightly golden, but there were no torches or candles burning and extinguishing in the flickering light. It was constant. It was like two small suns. They were releasing their weak light, illuminating the surrounding scene. That is, Kant frowned. He suddenly thought of the sun disk. But at this moment, the two small suns instantly exploded. The golden light continued to spread from the two suns. In the huge space inside the stone door, countless golden suns awaked by the golden light and began to light up. In the end, all the light converged into a hot golden light ray that shone on the sun disk in the middle. The sun disk was 300 meters long and was densely filled with the carved sacred sun patterns. It was more complicated than Kant's sacred sun pattern. Clearly, it hid more obscure and mysterious information. However, this sun disk was made of stone. A huge 200-meter tall stone statue was standing in front of the sun disk. In other words, the sun disk was a part of this stone statue. It wore ancient armor and held the ancient long sword in front of it with both hands. It looked like a human, but there was a sacred sun pattern on its forehead. Golden light flickered in its eyes, and there was also golden light shining on it, giving it the prestige of a god. Kant's breathing was a little rough. Even the god of war, Edmund, who was worshipped in the largest temple of the dukedom of Leo, did not have such an insolent statue, nor did it have such a large space. It could be said that it was built like a hollow mountain. This is really the relic of the holy city of gold. Kant gritted his teeth and endured the shock to recover. The surrounding Swadian sergeants, the Ravenstern Rangers, and Rodic-trained spearmen had also recovered. However, there was still shock and fear in their eyes. They subconsciously clenched the weapons in their hands, they gritted their teeth to prevent themselves from paying attention to those magnificent buildings and stone statues. Instead, they swept their eyes forward and vigilantly looked at the pile of black egg-shaped objects in the distance. Among them were countless pseudo-demonized wolves. They were bared their teeth and stared at them with their scarlet eyes. "Prepare for battle," Kant ordered. He also noticed that under the magnificent buildings and the golden light, in the center of the alley behind the stone door, countless huge black flesh eggs were trembling. As they trembled, the demonized wolves with a few scales on their bodies were being expelled from the flesh eggs. Soon, they joined the remaining demonized wolves and gathered together with low howl. They could not walk very well, but their furious and brutal emotions were transmitted through their scarlet eyes. As if sensing the arrival of Kant and the others, the black flesh eggs expelled the demonized wolves faster and faster. There were also more and more of them, and they became more and more agile. Turning his head slightly, Kant said to James, "Tell the reserve team to come down." "Understood," James nodded. He quickly walked towards the entrance of the cave, shouting loudly at the cave. His voice was loud, and it was quickly transmitted to the sceneway range outside the cave. "Abnormal situation detected. Reserve team, move in. Abnormal situation detected. Reserve team, move in." The voice appeared outside. The 50 Swadian knights, who had already dismounted and were ready, immediately lined up neatly and rushed in. At the same time, Manad drew out his knight sword and brought the 20 Ravenstern Rangers in with quick steps. The entire tunnel immediately rang with hurried and dense footsteps, as well as the sounds of armor clashing against each other. In less than 10 minutes, all the troops appeared in this 100 square meter space. Although it was crowded, they were all staring at the dazzling golden light behind the stone door with their eyes wide opened. There were countless sarcomas like black flesh eggs underneath. And there were hundreds and thousands of pseudo-demonized wolves that had just been discharged. Countless of them were staring with their scarlet eyes, slowly assembling and adapting to this world. "Advance," Kant was full of confidence. Chapter 197, The Coffins Under the Statue. They all entered the stone door. The golden light brightened up the entire space. The entire sky was as bright as day without any torches. When Kant raised his head to look around, he finally realized. He underestimated the size of this space. Because this space was 500 meters high, at least thousands of acres of space. It was like someone really emptied out the entire mountain to build this place. Moreover, after many years of carving and decoration, it still had a beautiful and glorious appearance until now. The huge stone statue was facing the alley where Kant was. It was a straight and wide road. The thick and heavy stone slabs were neatly cut, and the surface was engraved with the mysterious sacred sun pattern. As the golden light shone on the top of the head, it flickered with a faint golden light. On both sides of the road, there were small stone statues with worn-off faces, but there were not many that remained intact. Some were broken, some were collapsed, and some were destroyed. The black flesh eggs scattered over the road on the empty square. These eggs had already squeezed the position of these small stone statues, thus destroying many of them. However, just by looking at the outline, one could see that these small stone statues were not ordinary stone statues. They were all fully armed warriors, wearing ancient armor and holding ancient weapons. They looked like guards, guarding the end of the road, standing in front of the sun disk and the huge statue that was shining with golden light and displaying its divine prestige. They were the loyal divine servants. The relic in the belly of the mountain were incomparably majestic. Even Kant still had shock in his heart. He had seen many CG animations or movie special effects in his previous life, and there were definitely not many that could compare to this. Perhaps the Palace of Lonely Mountain belonging to the dwarf in The Lord of the Rings, and the Plains of Oblivion in Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim could compare to this relic. Although this relic was not as huge and grand as Palace of Lonely Mountain, nor was it as mysterious and bizarre as the Plains of Oblivion. The combination of the resplendent golden light and the dazzling brilliance was not inferior to the two. Especially the god statue at the center. It made Kant yearn for it. When he faced this huge and magnificent thousands-years-old god statue, his heart still beat slightly faster. It was like he was facing the god that truly existed in this world, and this god statue could also come to life in the golden light at any time. It would become a true god that people worshipped. But now, Kant was not facing this visual impact, but the pseudo-demonized wolf pack. These wolves began to roar, scratching the ground, and slowly gather together, and ready to charge. Whoosh 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 whoosh. 20 Ravenstern Wardens and 7 Ravenstern Rangers took the lead in shooting. Kant did not need to command them here. With their backs against the alley behind them, these archers seemed to be familiar with the place already. They fired arrows at the wolf pack that had already gathered in a dense formation 100 meters away, one by one impaling their eyes and glabella. They shot the demonized wolves to death on the spot without the slightest hesitation. While the demonized wolves were still recovering after discharged from the black flesh eggs, these Ravensterns already beat up these pity wolves without giving them any chance for recovery. They were very good at it. Just like how they dealt with the barbarian tribes in the Misty Mountains. They took the shortest time to kill their enemies before the enemies adapted to the hillside after leaving the mountain range and the arrow rain attacks that far exceeded the enemy's equipment level. They took the opportunity to deplete the enemy's morale and vitality more, alleviating the pressure they would face in the upcoming decisive battle. This was the excellent tactic that the Ravenstern people had summed up. Whoosh 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 sounds were incessant. The 27 archers shoot down the wolf packs 100 meters away within a short period of time. Each archer took the life of a demonized wolf. Moreover, there were still the 10 Swadian snipers behind them. Although their firing speed was relatively slow, every time they pulled the trigger, the more powerful crossbow would still crash the head of the wolves, knock them away and let them die miserably. Wild beasts were never the enemy of the human army. Because they were not worthy. Faced with such casualties, these pseudo-demonized wolves seemed unable to withstand it. Many of them were still strong and could run quickly. They let out fierce howls and charged towards Kant and the others. Then, they were shot to death on the spot one by one. The reaction of low-level Ravenstern Wardens were not inferior at all. Under the continuous shooting, the demonized wolves' attacks were ineffective. They could not even get within 30 meters of Kant and the others. They could only be exhausted by these archers in vain, shoot to death by the whistling arrows over and over. All of a sudden, the archers released all their arrows. At least 300 demonized wolves fell. Only the demonized wolves that just came out of the flesh eggs were still soaked with blood and limping. These demonized wolves were still struggling to attack, but they were still killed by the arrows. How can a beast be a match for a human? James shook his head slightly, his tone calm. The 50 Swadian knights behind him stood in a row with cold faces. They did not have any expression on their faces at all because they had experienced more tragedies. Every knight and sergeant had fought their way through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. They were all executioners, butchers, and war fanatics. At the same time, Kant waved his hand and said, "Take care of them." The 13 Swadian sergeants and 50 Swadian knights immediately stepped forward slowly. At the same time, Kant looked at the 20 Rodic trained spearmen behind him and ordered them, "And you guys, don't just stand there. Put down your backpacks. It's time for you to show off." "Yes, yes." These Rodics were already stunned, but they still forcefully came back to their senses and moved forward together. The spears in their hands were still quite powerful, and they were the first to stab those unthreatening demonized wolves to death in front of the level 5 troop class. Meanwhile, the soldiers and knights were also happy to relax. At their level, ordinary battles could no longer provide experience points. Or according to the system, they already maxed out their levels. After all, in the original version, a level 5 troop class was equivalent to a top troop class. Although the Kingdom of Nords had stronger level 6 footmen, For other kingdoms, level 5 represented the end and the glory of the strongest. After all, some kingdoms did not even have level 5 troop. For example, Kyrgyz Khanate, the top close combat lancer cavalry was only a level 4 cavalry. These small problems were not Kant's concern. He only needed to let Rhodoc-trained spearmen kill all of these demonized wolves. It would be good for them up to level 4 footmen, Rhodoc veteran spearmen would do. These experienced footmen were wearing chain armor, carried wide shields and long-hilted sabers. They were extremely powerful when grouped together. They were the most ideal main force to carry the front line. Before the kingdom of Swadia had split up with the kingdom of Rhodocs, when the Swadian knights attacked, these veteran spearmen were the main force responsible for stabilizing the defensive line, allowing the knights to charge at ease. They did not have to worry about their own defensive line behind them. Instead, they took the opportunity to be broken through by the enemy. Back then, in the Kyrgyz Khanate grassland, or in the snowy plains of Vaigirs, or in the coastal area of Nord, these Rhodocs people played an absolute role. It was not until the conflict between Harlaus and the noble of Rhodocs led to a split that the kingdom of Swadia lost the steady support of its footmen. Only then, the kingdom of Swadia continuously lose in a series of battles, causing the other countries to rapidly expand, causing this once dominant kingdom to lost a large amount of land. They could only settle in the central region and defend a few cities to wait for changes. When Kant and his troops were serious, it was very easy to deal with these pseudo-demonized wolves. Even the dark flesh eggs no longer sent out demonized wolves to die. The Rhodocs quickly returned. They respectfully reported to Kant, "My lord, the demonized wolves in the entire relic have been dealt with. Please continue to give orders." "Cut open all these flesh eggs," Kant said faintly. "It's a little uncomfortable to look at." He was obviously talking about those pitch-black, trembling, and slightly squirming flesh eggs. There was also a huge crack at the bottom where the organs of the demonized wolves were excreted. Yes, these Rhodocs immediately accepted the order. However, the Swadian knight also looked at these flesh eggs with curiosity. When they heard Kant's order to the Rhodocs, they also drew the knight sword from their waists and swung it at the soft flesh eggs. Whoosh! It was like the cowhide had been cut open. A pile of dark red blood suddenly appeared in the huge flesh egg and spilled out. The rich bloody smell had a rotten smell, and the entire flesh egg seemed to have dried up along with the huge wound. Many demonized wolves that were still attached to the umbilical cord flowed out of the eggs. The knights stepped back and frowned at the demonized wolves that were still attached to the umbilical cord. They thrust their swords forward and sliced open the throats of the unborn demonized wolves. Could this be the place where demonized creatures are produced? James exclaimed from behind Kant. He watched as the flesh of the eggs were sliced open and dried up, releasing balls of dark red blood and demonized wolves. He couldn't help but guess, could it be that all the demonized creatures in the Sinway range were produced by these pitch-black flesh eggs? Kant narrowed his eyes and didn't answer. However, he also had this question in his heart, because this was the first time he saw how demonized creatures were produced, and it was also the first time he saw these pitch-black flesh eggs. Even the books of the Dukedom of Leo did not record it. As for the origin of the demonized creatures, it was even more strange. There was no book that mentioned these flesh eggs, nor was there any book that mentioned the inferior half-finished products like these pseudo-demonized wolves. All the flesh eggs were destroyed, and hundreds of flesh eggs became shriveled. Kant would send people to get rid of these eggs and burn them with oil some other day. This relic had completely hollowed out the mountainside. Perhaps it was a good choice to develop a secret base under the Aran village. Kant frowned slightly. Kant looked at the center of the 2 feet of the huge statue. In front of the 10-meter-wide sword blade, a high platform stood there. There seemed to be rectangular objects placed on it, and it was guarded by more small stone statues, as if they were praying. It also seemed like they were worshipping it. Kant saw it clearly. It was clearly a stone coffin. Chapter 198, A Beautiful Girl. Kant led James and all the soldiers forward with quick steps. They walked along the road towards the giant statue. The statue was hundreds of meters tall, walking along the road guarded by the small stone statues on both sides of the road. They could feel their own insignificance when they reached the foot of the statue, as well as the grandeur of this giant statue. Looking up from the bottom, the supreme power of a god directly impacted the depths of their minds. If their minds weren't firm, they would have already knelt in front of the shining golden statue. Just like on the stair in front of Kant, the small statues kneeling on the stair lowered their heads and half knelt respectfully, not even daring to raise their heads. They were all carved into a completely loyal appearance. Lord Kant, perhaps what I feel is wrong. James spoke slowly behind him, his tone somewhat solemn. I don't know why, but I feel that this relic is instead like a mausoleum specially built for the coffin on the stair. Kant nodded. He didn't confirm, nor did he deny. In fact, when he saw the rectangular stone coffin on the stone platform, which was nearly 5 meters long and 3 meters wide, this thought also emerged in his mind. Manad followed behind, holding the night sword in his hand tightly. The merchant's face was now a little shocked. Compared to the mausoleum I once knew, this one hollowed out the mountain and directly carved such a large-scale god statue. How many years will it take to build it? He paused, he gulped. This is much harder than building a city. It was more than difficult. It was almost impossible. Emptying out a mountain was extremely troublesome even in the modern society Kant once knew, let alone in this foreign world in the era of cold weapons. Even with the aid of magic, even with the help of divine spell, building such a magnificent building was too extravagant. In Kant's eyes, it was definitely not so simple to build a mausoleum. Moreover, as a lost city in the era of gods thousands of years ago, it was also not a cost-effective behavior to build such a large-scale mountain structure just for the sake of a mausoleum. The age of the gods was still the age of cold weapons. It had high-end combat strength. It was said that it could easily destroy a mountain range. But even so, how could these high-end combat strength be used up for the sake of an ordinary mausoleum? Just like how those high-ranking noble families would not protect the safety of civilians in all aspects. This was ridiculous. The people who built this building during the age of the gods were still ordinary people. Kant could even guess that they had used up countless lives and blood of ordinary people in order to build the building inside this mountain. Only then did they finally dug up this mountain and carved such a magnificent giant statue and the amazing, almost miraculous sun disk. He took a deep breath. The thick smell of blood was irritating. Kant said in a deep voice, "Go and take a look." However, he did not walk up to the high platform. Instead, he gestured to the Rhodoc-trained spearman and ordered, "Go, open that coffin." This was almost like an act of suicide. If there was a trap, then those Rhodoc-trained spearmen would all die. But they didn't care. Instead, they fearlessly strode toward the stone platform. It was their honor to die for Lord Kant. However, there was no trap on the stone platform. Instead, countless golden light flowed above their heads. At the same time, an extremely fine but pure golden ray of light refracted from the sun disk and gathered on the two eyes of the statue. Then, the two eyes refracted the light ray to the long sword that was held in both hands and then shot into the front of the 10 meters wide long sword. The long sword that was dozens of meters tall cut into the platform directly, as if the tip of the long sword had pierced into the mountain. The coffin was half a meter in front of the long sword. The fine golden ray also shot into the center of the coffin along with the long sword. The 20 Rhodoc-trained spearmen looked at each other and came to the surroundings of the coffin. They nodded at each other, stretched out their hands and placed them on the edge of the coffin, forcefully pushing it to the side. Creak, creak, creak. The stone coffin lid was pushed, making an unpleasant sound. However, there was definitely a pulley inside the coffin lid or somewhere that allowed it to be pushed. Otherwise, Rhodocs would not be able to push it. Creak, creak, creak. As if the coffin lid had been pushed to its limit, faint creaking sounds could be heard from inside. The golden light continued to shine down. However, the target was not the stone coffin lid, but the deeper part of the coffin. "This is gold!" the relic exclaimed. As the light shone in, the brilliant golden light instantly covered the entire interior of the stone coffin. It was like countless golden liquids were flowing inside, which made their eyes wide opened. Their originally simple personality was now tinged with greed and desire. "Get out of the way," Kant walked over at this time. These relics maintained their loyalty and immediately retreated to the side. There was a look of shame on their faces. It was obvious that they were feeling guilty for their greed. However, no one cared about these things now. This. Manet and James also walked over, their faces filled with shock. Inside the stone coffin was another layer of coffin made of gold. Countless complicated and profound sacred sun pattern were carved on it, emitting a shocking liquid-like golden light along with the golden light ray that descended from above. It looked like a mysterious power was flowing within this huge stone coffin and accumulating. "Ka ka ka." The sound of metal rotating suddenly sounded. Kant's expression changed slightly. The people beside him also subconsciously tightened their grip on the weapons in their hands. The circulating golden light instantly began to shrink, completely melting into the golden coffin. The coffin actually slowly opened to both sides, like a treasure box made from the most sophisticated instruments. Then, a face appeared in front of Kant. Fair, tender, and exquisite. The closed eyes had long eyelashes, a ruddy little mouth, and long golden hair. It was a beautiful girl. The clothes on her body was a long robe made of special gold threads. It was complicated and elegant. As the golden coffin was opened, it was exposed to the golden light inside. The golden light seemed to be flowing with golden liquid. The beautiful girl's forehead lit up slightly. The mysterious sacred sun pattern was spreading on her forehead. It started to extend to both sides of her forehead and eventually turned into a pattern that looked like wings. At the same time, a threatening aura came from her. Kant felt his mouth dry. He wanted to say something. However, in the golden coffin, the beautiful girl's eyebrows flickered. Her eyes were closed, but she started to blink their long eyelashes and slowly opened her eyes. It was a golden pair of eyes. They were pure, as if they were made of the most authentic gold. She was emitted the pressure as a superior being. Just a single glance was enough to make Kant and the others, who were standing around the coffin, continuously retreat. However, that rosy little mouth slowly opened. "Are you the servant who woke me up? You actually lost your sacred sun pattern as a servant. Then, what era is it now?" The voice trembled slightly. However, in less than 2 seconds, the voice had become clear and fluent. A terrifying aura circulated. Everyone around the coffin could not help but take half a step back. The beautiful girl who was lying in the golden coffin did not receive any response. Instead, she flew into the air and faced the golden light. She turned her head to look at the huge ruins that were filled with the smell of blood. A hint of anger appeared in her golden eyes. "The power of the hell devils has actually defiled my temple." Kant's heart seemed to be tightly gripped. However, he still raised his left hand, indicating for everyone behind him to remain calm. Because the archers behind him were already ready. Even the Swadian knights and sergeants had already gripped their knight swords or bastard swords tightly. Under their helmets, their eyes were filled with shock and brazenness, as well as their undisguised killing intent. However, Kant did not give the order to attack. At this moment, they did not dare to act on their own. No one knew what kind of power this beautiful girl who floated out of the golden coffin possessed. Especially the small amount of golden light radiating from her body, it shocked everyone. They were all from normal human society, they had never seen such power before. Even those wardens and rangers from the world of Pender which filled with magic, they usually did not able to see magic either. And this beautiful girl floating above the coffin looked at the numerous soldiers in front of her with a hint of killing intent. Her eyes were indifferent and filled with disdain. She stretched out her white and tender finger and pointed it at Kant. Explain the situation. I will promote you to the servant of the sun god and open your sacred inscription. However, Kant remained silent. He lowered his head and seemed to be in deep thought. The surrounding soldiers were breathing rapidly. They were all waiting for orders. However, a new dialogue box appeared on Kant's retina. Ding! After your tireless efforts, the main quest has been completed. Main quest, the secret in the cave has been completed. Reward, 50,000 dinars, 5,000 reputation, 5 honor. Introduction, a magnificent relic has appeared in this cave. There is a different kind of darkness under the seemingly bright background. Perhaps this is still a new secret, but you still need to do a lot more. In an instant, the dialogue box for the completion of the main quest popped up. However, the dialogue box was refreshed. Ding! Main quest is released. Main quest, absorption. Reward, the system's new function is activated. Introduction, you have discovered this beautiful girl. She seems to be hiding a mystery. This is a power that surpasses cognition. Absorb her, and you will receive a new power. The words on the dialogue box were simple and clear. Kant's lips curled up slightly. He had already made a decision in his heart, and he raised his head slightly to look at this beautiful girl floating in front of him. He held the hilt of the night sword in his hand. Beautiful girl? What a good material to absorb. Chapter 199, A Descendant of the Ancient Race. Kant lowered his head, as if to show his humility in front of this beautiful girl. But his palm gently gripped the hilt of his sword. The golden light above his head shone brightly, and the power that belonged to the sun slowly flowed. Meanwhile, this girl, who was wearing a complicated and gorgeous dress made of golden threads, slowly floated in front of Kant. She was like a god who stood high above. Her delicate red lips opened, and her voice was very indifferent. Servant, quickly answer my question. This is the current era. Kant laughed lightly, and his mouth was filled with mockery. He slightly raised his head to look at the beautiful girl whose thigh was floating in front of him. The malevolence in his eyes intensified, and he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. He instantly swung out his sword. This is the cruel era. A cold light flashed. The blade of the sword instantly tore apart the complicated clothes that the beautiful girl was wearing. Bright red blood instantly splattered. The beautiful girl who had just walked out of the golden coffin did not understand what had happened. There was still a stunned expression on her delicate and fair face. She looked at Kant with disbelief in her eyes. However, Kant looked directly into her eyes. The body of a knight brought sufficient close combat experience and decisive action. He used the night sword directly stabbed at the girl. The blade directly pierced through the beautiful girl's chest. As a large amount of blood began to flow out of her luxurious clothes made of golden threads, the golden light that was originally floating around her seemed to have lost control and instantly spread out in all directions. It shattered into pieces, and an angry shout was heard. No, you damn despicable! The beautiful girl finally remembered to retreat, and the intense pain caused her eyes to be filled with fear. Her floating body flew backwards, her chest and heart had already pierced through, but the night sword pierced deeply into her body again. As she retreated, she pulled it out, causing a large amount of blood to flow out from her internal organs. All the strength in her body dissipated with the blood, and she fell heavily under the giant stone longsword. Kill! James and Manet's voices rang out almost at the same time. But the soldiers behind did not move. Because Kant shouted immediately after, all of you, stop! After a pause, he slowly took a breath and said in a deep voice, I'll do this myself. The system completely relied on him to do the absorption. He slowly walked over with his night sword in hand. The refined leather boots stepped on the stone slab, and the sound of faint footsteps could be heard. Kant looked emotionlessly at the beautiful girl who was clutching her chest and coughing up blood. The bright red blood dyed her exquisite dress red, and the terrified and incredulous look on her beautiful face, it added some pitiful beauty of after being tortured, making people feel a sense of pity in their hearts. She pointed at Kent with her rosy slender finger. She coughed up blood but could not suppress the anger in her heart. "You lowly servant, how dare you kill the descendant of a god?" "The descendant of a god?" Kent walked over, his face still calm. Their eyes met. His eyes looked at those golden eyes that seemed to be made of gold. The corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. He slowly squatted down and looked at the girl who was breathing rapidly up close. Blood was flowing out of her nostrils and mouth. He said faintly, "The descendant of the sun god? Aren't you too weak? You are really too weak. You lowly." It was as if Kant's words made the beautiful girl angry, and her eyes shone with a golden light. A mysterious pattern instantly appeared in her snow lily white palm, mixing with the surrounding blood and golden light, and emitting a certain heat. Whoosh! The shrill sound of an arrow instantly tore through the air, brushing past Kant's ears, and fluttering a few strands of hair. Arg! The beautiful girl let out a weak and miserable howl. Her fair and tender palm was actually instantly pierced through by an arrow and nailed to the giant long sword behind her. Fresh blood flowing continuously from her palm, the blazing heat and golden light that had originally gathered in her palm were directly torn into pieces by this arrow. The temperature disappeared and the golden light dispersed. Kant turned his head slightly and looked at the ranger behind him who was putting away his bow. He reprimanded, "You have no gentlemanly manners. How dare you treat a lady like this?" At the same time, he turned his head to look at the beautiful girl whose face was distorted due to the pain, which ruined the delicate beauty on her face. He said with an apologetic tone, "I hope you don't take offense. They are all rude soldiers. They have never seen such mysterious extraordinary power. Oh, or should I say divine spell? I don't understand it either. If it's possible, can you explain it to me?" The beautiful girl's palm was nailed to the stone wall of the sword. The intense pain and the weakness in her heart made her feel extremely hopeless. Looking at Kant's calm eyes, a fear that originated from the depths of her soul crept into her heart. Kant chuckled, "You don't want to say it." He reached out and slowly caressed the beautiful girl's cheek, feeling her fascinating and expected tenderness. He said faintly, "To be honest, I am shocked that you have survived from the gods' era thousands of years ago until now. After all, the lost city, oh, it should be the holy city of gold mentioned in the ancient books, has long been destroyed in the yellow sand of the Naran desert. The civilization has already disappeared, and only a few remain, as well as you, mysterious lady." He wanted to know more. This mysterious, beautiful girl who had woken up in the coffin might be able to give him some unknown information. Thousands of years, tens of thousands of years ago in the gods' era. It was already too far away from the present, and this woman actually came from that era. This made Kant surprised and curious. Thousands of years gods' era, but when she heard Kant's words, the beautiful girl's eyes suddenly widened, and a slight tremulous voice appeared in her tone. "No, impossible, Father clearly let me wake up after sleeping for 10 years. She seemed to have thought of something. She suddenly looked at Kant, and her breathing was rapid, her golden eyes carried a fierce expression. "I remember now, there are people from the slave race who rebelled and colluded with the abyss demons to attack our holy city of gold. That's right, it's you. Because of betrayal from you people, Father God fell. Otherwise, with Father God's great power to control the sun, those demons from the abyss would definitely not able to withstand it. It was all because of your people's betrayal that all of this happened." The beautiful girl seemed to understand everything, her eyes were filled with schadenfreude. You don't have extraordinary power. The extraordinary power of this world is declining. No wonder I can't use the power bestowed by Father God. I can't sense the power contained in this world either. So that's how it is. After the gods fell, the rules of this world began to change. You miscalculated. You damn slaves miscalculated. Didn't you obtain the greatest victory? You are also at the lowest point. If Father God's power were to awaken again, you would definitely not able to withstand our anger. You traitors! No, I'm not a traitor. Kant smiled and spoke with a calm expression. He did not have any reaction to the beautiful girl's words. Instead, he leaned on his knight's sword. The fresh blood on it had not been wiped off yet. He looked into those golden eyes, he said faintly, "Power? I don't understand, but I know that I can easily kill you now. I think you'd better choose to cooperate. Otherwise, I guarantee that you will die a miserable death." The descendant of the Father God never surrenders. The beautiful girl's face was filled with anger, and her eyes were filled with deep hatred. You pathetic and lowly slaves will eventually become our slaves again, becoming us. She didn't finish her words. Even the anger and hatred on her face didn't fade away. Kant's knight sword stabbed into her body again. It wasn't the chest that had been pierced, but the throat. It heavily pierced through the beautiful girl's throat, cutting her trachea and the muscles that connected to the spine of her neck. It directly pierced through the stone wall of the sword behind her. So much nonsense. Kant stood up and pulled out his knight sword again. The beautiful girl's head directly fell onto the busty and perky chest along with the broken spine. Only the two sides of her neck skin and a small amount of muscles were still intact, so the girl did not turn into a headless corpse, but no matter how one looked at it, this corpse was quite miserable. Kant's two attacks were completely fatal attacks, the kind that did not leave any survivors. Poor, this is a beauty that makes people drool. Manad walked over and handed Kant a linen handkerchief. But she chose to resist you, Lord Kant. Kant was expressionless. He used the linen handkerchief to wipe the blade and said indifferently, "Having you is enough." He turned his head to look at the troops behind him who were walking over and said in a deep voice, "Women are just useless vases that can be bought at any time." "That's because you haven't met true love," James shook his head. He looked at the beautiful woman's corpse with pity. "My lord, it's time for you to have a girlfriend. If possible, I can help you with the introduction of a few noble women in Karadia. However, those greedy noble women are not worthy of your identity. Now is not the time to talk about this." Kant looked at the middle-aged man and ordered, "Lead the troops to inspect the battlefield. I think you can do it well." "Yes, Lord Kant." James nodded. He also understood that he seemed to have said too much. But Kant did not care. This was typically James. If it was in the game, according to the characteristic of this good-natured man, he would probably refuse to kill this unarmed woman. Otherwise, it would be a violation of his philosophy. Now, he was complaining a little. It could be said that it was his character. But what Kant cared about was the absorption method that the system gave after this woman died. Ding system prompt. Please place your hand on the pattern on her forehead. Kant did as he was told. He squatted down again and used his hands to support the head that had already broken with spine and neck. He looked at the eyes that had already faded, as well as the beautiful face that had a hint of malevolence. He pressed his thumb on the sacred sun pattern on her forehead that looked like a pair of spreading wings. Chapter 200, The Demon That Broke the Seal. As he pressed his thumb on the exquisite and mysterious sacred sun pattern on her forehead, the system's data stream instantly appeared in the void. Kant saw that the data stream directly wrapped around the head in his hands, allowing the data to seep into the beautiful eyes, ears, nostrils, and mouth. A dialog box quickly popped up on his retina. Ding! After your untiring efforts, the main quest has been completed. Main quest, absorption completed. Reward, the system's new function has been activated. Introduction, with your help, the system discovered the hidden power in this world from this beautiful girl, the system appreciated for your help. Remark, the system has completed the database, new function has been activated. The absorption ended. The head in Kant's hand still looked beautiful, but it had lost some of its luster. This was a corpse. Kant did not care at all. He threw the head down and stood up. Compared to capture this beautiful girl who once existed in the gods' era, Kant thought that completing the system's main quest was more useful. And the myths had disappeared in the river of time, it was not worth paying attention to, those were all useless information now. They were not information at all. Even if Kant knew why the so-called Father God had fallen and why the so-called Holy City of Gold had been betrayed. So what? It was already 1,000 years later, a new era. Kant stood here. He was a member of this era. He easily killed this beautiful woman who obviously had a high status from the once existed mythological era. It also proved that the new era was not necessarily inferior to the previous mythological era. At the very least. Since he could kill this woman, it also meant that he could kill the existence in the mythological era that had come back to life. Kant had the golden finger, he would not submit to the bloodline of these gods, nor would he worship those high and mighty gods. Even when he was in the dukedom of Leo, he did not even enter the temple of the god of war to be baptized and become a believer of the god of war, Edmund. Instead, he went to the academy and became a scholar who pursued knowledge and truth. The era of the gods had long gone. Humans were the masters of this land. Even if the other races had also developed their own kingdoms and forces. The races that relied solely on the power of the gods had long developed themselves and become the overlords of the new era. Even if the gods reappeared, it was estimated that they would have a fight with the royal authorities in front of them. Moreover, Kant had already heard what this woman said. This world could no longer accommodate more powerful supernatural powers. Combining the supernatural powers that Kant had known in the past, Kant understood in his heart. If his prediction was not wrong, this world should be at the end of magic era. The armies between races were the symbol of strength, and supernatural powers had long been reduced as an auxiliary means. Just as what Kant understood. When the extraordinary power could not conquer anymore, then they would lose their past glory, and the royal power would once again occupy the top of the power. The noble who controlled the army were the powerful people in this world. Even if it was divine power, or the mages who controlled the extraordinary power, they all had to lower their heads in front of this royal power and compromise with each other. In the cave of the relic, the golden light was still bright. Kant turned his head and looked at the left and right sides of the coffin. Each of them had a small sun disk. There were the only real sun disks in the relic. They were made of gold. The other sun disks were all made of stone. However, because of the sacred sun pattern on them, they reflected this mysterious golden light, forming a bright light that filled the sky, just like daylight. There seemed to be nothing left in this relic. Only the thick stench of blood covered the ground. Under the leadership of James and Manad, the soldiers carefully searched the other areas on both sides of the stone platform. However, other than the collapsed stones and the collapsed stone buildings, they did not find anything of value. For example, gold, silver, gems, and other common funerary objects were not found. If it wasn't for this coffin, this place didn't look like a mausoleum, nor did it look like a pure temple. It was more like a sanctuary or a secret gathering place. Kant narrowed his eyes. His eyes swept across the pitch-black flesh eggs. They had all been cut open by the soldiers with swords, releasing all the blood and embryos inside and killing them. But when he saw these things, he still had a strange feeling in his heart, just like these pitch-black flesh eggs, it was not that simple. But Kant thought that it was indeed not that simple. He turned his head slightly. The decapitated female corpse was completely dead. But he still remembered that when this beautiful girl was alive, she saw the pitch-black flesh eggs below, the anger on her face, and said that the power of the demons of the abyss that had defiled this temple. There was indeed a temple on the peak of the mountain outside, but it had already turned into ashes when Kant took down the sun disk. This was also the reason why he did not dare to take down the two sun disks. The consequences of taking them down. Perhaps it was this relic that directly turned into ashes, and even caused the mountain to collapse. The village of Roduk, Aaron, which was located on the peak of the mountain, might directly turned into ashes too. Kant had spent a lot of effort to obtain this additional village, the second base in the future. He afraid it would completely turn into a bubble, turn into ruins. My lord. And just as Kant was deep in thought, a Swadian sergeant came over. With a solemn expression, he reported, "We discovered an abnormal situation. When we were cutting these pitch-black flesh eggs, we discovered that these flesh eggs all extended out from the ground, just like plants that grew out." What? Kant frowned, his face a little solemn. He walked to the flesh eggs at the edge of the stone platform. Some knights had already cut open these flesh eggs, just like thick skin. After completely peeling them, they could still find that at the bottom of these flesh eggs, there was a black hole of about half a meter. The edges were covered with dark skin and fat, as if it was some kind of biological tube. It trembled slightly and secreted a smelly dark red liquid. It seemed that what was secreted was actually blood, which was almost the same as the blood flowing in the bodies of the demonized wolves. The situation is not good. James and Manad stood side by side. Kant's face was solemn. It is indeed not good. These flesh eggs were connected, which meant that there was probably some unknown space at the bottom of this relic. It might even be hiding the key to the formation of those pseudo-demonized creatures. Kant even suspected that all the demonized creatures in the Sceneway range were bred in this way. Burn these flesh eggs. Kant still ordered solemnly, after we go out, have people carefully look after the inside of the relic. If there are any abnormal situations, immediately report it. If we encounter an enemy that we can't defend against, or even can't deal with at all, then defend the platform outside the cave or retreat to the council hall to defend. Understood, James and the soldiers behind him nodded. Caw. But just as Kant ordered, the sound of a rock cracking suddenly appeared in the relic. Everyone's faces were solemn. They instantly pulled out their weapons, but they orderly took half a step back. What's going on? Is this place going to collapse? James's face turned even uglier. He raised his head and looked at the walls above and around him, but he didn't find any cracks. He couldn't help but remind, "It's not safe here, Lord Kant. We have to evacuate this relic." No, Manad turned his head to look at the stone platform. The sound came from there. Kant turned his head to look. The intense stone cracking was indeed there. Even the stone platform had a dent. That's... The sharp-eyed Ravenstern Ranger immediately lifted his heavy bow, his face filled with horror. Someone's there. All the footmen instantly returned to their battle status. Manad and James's breathing quickened. Kant was the same. Because at the edge of the stone platform in front of them, a 2-meter wide hole slowly appeared, and a tall figure wrapped in a pitch-black robe slowly climbed out under the lifting of the pitch-black blood vessel like tentacles. A dangerous aura spread, and even the entire relic became dark. Ha ha ha! I finally broke the seal and came out. A dry laughter sounded. Countless pitch-black tentacles, thick or thin, floated behind the figure, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. The figure under the pitch-black robe slowly walked down the stone platform and stood unnaturally on the ground. After taking a few steps, she finally stood firm and turned her head to look at the beautiful woman in the complicated golden silk dress, then she turned her head to look at them. Her laughter became more pleasant and arrogant. "So it's you humans. You really betrayed these gods. Demon." Kant opened his mouth slightly, his tone extremely grave. Because right in front of them, that tall woman looked like a human. However, her slightly red skin, the goat horns on her forehead, the triangular tail behind her buttocks, and even the irregularly curved thighs on her lower body, she was not a human. Instead, she looked like the succubus that Kant had seen in movies and TV shows. That's right, the woman held the pitch-black tentacles behind her and slowly took a few steps forward. Her figure under the black robe was extremely hot and curvaceous, and her face was equally beautiful, even with a hint of exotic charm. He looked at Kant, who was obviously the leader, and gently stuck out his tongue to lick his lips. "Offer your sacrifice." I can let you enjoy extreme happiness." She slightly turned her beautiful face and swept her gaze over the knights and soldiers, her voice was even more moving. "Very good, you have done well. I urgently need to replenish myself. Since you can bring these sacrifices, I will properly reward you. Kill her." However, what responded to her was Kant's cold order. The Ravenstern Rangers and Wardens were already prepared. They instantly drew their bows and shot arrows. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The arrow arrived in an instant. Her eye sockets, forehead and chest were instantly hit by the arrow. That powerful force directly sent the demon flying. She didn't even make a sound before she fell heavily to the ground. She struggled a few times before she completely lost her breath. And right behind her, the pitch-black originally energetic tentacles seemed to have lost their strength as they fell to the ground one after another. Even the pitch-black flesh and eggs seemed to shrivel up completely.